However, as I explained earlier, if we do not have historical record, and we cannot have archaeological findings, because obviously wrestling is a living heritage, is not an object or artifact. We can't physically find evidence of that. The only thing that we are left with is use logic, rational thinking, and common sense. And this is precisely what the supporters of wrestling being important in olden day warfare are also trying to use. For example, one of the most common and crucial arguments that those people like to use is that if you look at the Western world, for example, the ancient Greek, ancient Rome, medieval knight, as well as if you look at Japanese feudal samurai period, all of them uses wrestling in their warfare. And if everyone else in the world does that, then China must have done it too, even though we don't actually have very strong, solid evidence to prove it. Now, I'm by no means an expert on ancient Western culture and history and warfare, but from what I managed to dig up, it seems that, for example, in Greek, the Spartans, their most important military practice involved around building a shield formation. In fact, they purposely make the shield more towards the left-hand side, so it will cover the person on the left, and their right-hand side get covered by the person next to them. And this kind of shield, it only works if you're, or shall I say, it works the best when you're in a formation, right? They actually design the shield to accommodate for this particular formation. And from that we can see that shield formation, and then using either spear or short sword, is a main mode of combat, and wrestling goes against this kind of tactic. So what the ancient Greek and Romans are well known for wrestling, I don't believe is actually what they use on the battlefield. And the same can go for the Romans, right? The Romans are most famous for the scutum shield formation, and they went a step beyond the Greeks. Instead of just having a shield in the front, they have shield on all four sides, even on top. It becomes literally a block. And that makes it very hard for the barbarians, whoever they are fighting, to penetrate their defense. And they'll breach the distance and then attack them with the spear or the Roman gladius, a short sword, and etc. And again, right from here we can see that the Romans most importantly favors discipline and formation. Right? It's not about individual heroism or how well an individual person can perform on the battlefield versus another individual. It's about how well they can work together. And the idea of using wrestling in the battlefield pretty much goes against its very core of its military method, which is to have correct formation and use discipline to defeat the enemy. Which is why, despite the fact that Greco-Roman wrestling is one of the oldest wrestling in the world and most famous, I don't believe it was actually important in the military warfare. It was more like a sport and a way to train your strength and endurance and character, shall I say. So I'm not saying that wrestling can't contribute or benefit military personnel, but I don't think the actual techniques or the actual method of wrestling is any useful on the battlefield. Now, this is quite different for the medieval knight. Again, I'm not an expert on feudal European history or medieval warfare, but again, from what I can dig up, it seems that the medieval knights do practice wrestling, and they do from time to time use wrestling in the battlefield. For example, here's a picture that the Chinese wrestling supporters often pose to support their argument. In it, we can see there is a Western painting of a knight having another knight, thrown to the ground, stepping over him and gonna finish him or threaten him with a sword. And often, they will pose this picture and say, you see, the medieval knight uses wrestling, and there's no difference for the Chinese battlefield. People also provide evidence of Japanese samurai, the kubujutsu, right, the older form of martial art, where some of the reels, they have a particular kata and techniques designed to throw someone wearing a Japanese samurai armor. And the argument again is that if they don't use it in a battlefield, why would they have certain techniques specifically designed for throwing someone with armor rather than someone wearing a kimono? So it is true that the medieval knight and the Japanese samurai did use some form of wrestling, and most likely on the battlefield. But that still does not mean the same can be applied for Chinese, because the problem here is, if you want to make comparison like that, you have to make sure that the Chinese social, military, and cultural structure is similar or identical to feudal European or feudal Japan, but they are not. So we're going to basically look at three important differences between the Chinese dynasty, social military structure compared to the feudal European and feudal Japan. So the first thing we're going to look at is their army composition and the number of armies that they have on average. Firstly, the one major similarity between feudal Japan and feudal European is that they both have a warrior class. Right? In European, it's the knight. In Japan, it's the samurai. What does this mean? That basically there are these are type of people. They're born into a family that does nothing but train and learn how to fight war. What that means is, the moment they're born into a knight family or a samurai family, the education from a childhood is to teach them how to fight, how to handle the different weapons, and then after that maybe empty-hand fighting if they need to, how to horse riding, etc., etc. That is the sole purpose of being on this earth. And what this means is that they can afford to have pretty much a very elite type of training, right? After they can master all the weaponry they need, with this archery, horse lancing, longsword, warhammer, polearm, whatever, they would also have time to learn something extra in case they lose their weapon, aka empty-hand kind of fighting, such as wrestling. But this is not the case for China, right? While in China, there were a nobility class from, Shang Dynasty, Western Zhou Dynasty, and to some extent, Spring, Autumn, and Warring States, where their nobility were the main participant of battle, right? Which we'll get to in more details in a bit. So there are people like that back in the old days, Shang, Western Zhou, and Spring, Autumn to Warring States. But as the Chinese dynasty progressed from Qin Dynasty to Han Dynasty and onwards, this kind of nobility class sort of fell away. While there are still nobilities in China, don't get me wrong, they are no longer the main participant of battle. What that means is you don't get born into a warrior family or warrior class and you're a warrior for life. Instead, with its general or captain or whatever military ranking, it is earned through your personal performance. In other words, those people, most of the time, were originally common folks or farmers that joined the military and then worked their way up into a higher rank and more important position. And their son aren't unnecessarily going to inherit their position. So what that means is they don't have the same kind of warm bed where they can train a child from birth in all kinds of combat technique and skills that are required for the warfare they have at the time. So just like the common foot soldiers of feudal Europe and feudal Japan, Chinese military mostly came from farmers. So farmers will get drafted to join the military, and then when they are not in war, they are still required to farm their land and provide food for themselves. The army need to provide food for themselves. It's not like an army that sits there, do nothing but training and get paid by the government. There are a few exceptions to this. For example, in the Western Zhou to Spring Autumn to Warring States, there has been actual professional soldiers, but the number are a lot less compared to the farmers in the land. And when they went to the Han Dynasty, due to the large number of militaries that they have, they can't just keep these guys on the payroll and let them do nothing. So instead, they're required to farm land and provide for themselves. And only when there is an invasion or a war, they take up arms and goes to war. And you can imagine that farming is a full-time job. 3 out of 4 seasons of the year, you are actively working in the field. And you can imagine how little time they have for training. And those time they have, they probably want to spend them on archery, on formation training, and polearm. And they wouldn't have time for something as unimportant as wrestling. This kind of habit extended all the way through to the Tang Dynasty, and towards the middle of Tang Dynasty, around Tang Xuanzong era, they started to have fully professional soldiers that get paid by the government to be soldier, and they're no longer required to farm land. So you might think, okay, then at that time they can afford to train wrestling, but unfortunately the mode of combat has changed, and we'll get to that in detail in a later bit. But for now, let's just say that there's no requirement or there's no purpose and need to use wrestling in the type of warfare they engage in at Tang Dynasty. And in the Song Dynasty, in the late Ming Dynasty, and then Qing Dynasty, they again had professional soldiers. But again, due to how warfare changed, which we'll discuss in the next part, we can then eventually see that there's actually very little to no need for wrestling. And if these soldiers have the time, there are much useful things that they could train in. And any of the commanding officers and going up all the way to the general, they're usually promoted from soldier depending on their achievement. And there's also through Tang Dynasty onwards, their imperial military exam that you can take, which then would allow you to become an officer rank and move up that way. And all these people, most of the time, they are not nobility. They are actually common folks and civilians, which is why there's never been a very strong warrior class in the Chinese dynasties from Han Dynasty and downwards. So therefore, it doesn't have the same kind of environment to breed elite warrior that excels in every aspect of war and combat. Another important thing here to note is that the scale of war happens in Europe, in Japan, and in China vastly differs. Now, of course, throughout the different period, different war, the numbers are different, but let's just, get a general idea. For example, during the 100-Year War, the French in total have around 50,000 to 60,000 troops, but they weren't stationed all at one place. They were basically spread out. In one location, I think at the most they have around 25,000 troops, where the English has around 30,000 troops in total. The number might not be accurate, but this is just a general idea. And then, when I looked up the ratio between knight and common foot soldier, again it differs, but it's roughly between one knight for every 10 soldier to about one knight to every 20 soldier. Now, why is this important? Well, it's because you can see how important an individual's combative ability would affect the battlefield. When there's one knight for every 10 or 20 soldier, if that one knight can kill 10 or 20 people with a soldier or other knight, then he is effectively affecting the overall battlefield. So that if the knight on one side are exceptionally skilled at combat, they can literally turn the tide of battle due to the ratio between an elite knight versus a common soldier. The same thing can be observed in Japan. I mean, Japan have even smaller scale. Some of the lord only has like 500, military troops. It goes out to a few thousand. Very seldom they actually have a war clashing between 10,000 and 10,000. They've never heard of numbers like over 100,000 in one battle on one side. So again, when I looked at the samurai to soldier ratio, it also varies greatly depending on what period and which lord from which area. But it can basically go from one samurai to every 3 soldier, one samurai to every 4 soldier, 6 soldier, 10 soldier, 20 soldier, and so forth. 20 is about max. And this shows you that in Japan, the samurai to foot soldier ratio is even greater than it is in feudal Europe. And that means, again, that the individual combative ability of these samurai elite warriors would impact the outcome of the war much greater. Whereas if you look at what happens in China, it's entirely different. Almost, again, the number varies, but usually a war will be fought by one side having around 100,000 to 200,000, sometimes even up to 600,000 men military versus another side. And you can see that in a battle like this, individual combative ability doesn't really matter that much in the overall outcome of the war. Where even if one elite warrior can kill 20 soldiers, unless the ratio between an elite and the non-elite is 1 to 10, 1 to 20, otherwise it really makes no difference. Now that we've already established that China does not have an elite warrior class like the knight or the samurai, as to the reason why is due to various social and cultural reasons and limitations that we're not going to go into detail here. But one of the reasons that we did talk about is the size of the warfare and the size of the army. It's just not very practical and it's not very effective to keep an elite warrior class when the war is fought on such a large scale. Which is why if you look at the West Zhou dynasty, Spring Autumn to warring state, during those periods where war were fought on a smaller scale, they were indeed the nobility, which can be interpreted as a type of elite warrior class that ride on chariot and fight in that way, which again we'll discuss in detail in a later video. But once China was united into one dynasty, hence from Qing dynasty and onwards, the army size gets so big that an elite warrior class simply just fell out of fashion, so to speak. Now some might argue that in the Chinese history, there is something known as jiangmen. What is referred to is a particular family that has many of its members being high-ranking officers or even generals in the dynasty's military infrastructure of that era. One of the good examples of this is the Li family between the Qing dynasty and Han dynasty. It starts from someone known as Li Xin. He was a well-known general of the Qing dynasty. Then his descendant, Fei Jiangjun Li Guang, was one of the most famous military generals of the Han Wudi era. And his son, Li Gan, and his grandson, Li Ling, they were all generals during the Han Wudi period. So this, at a glance, might look like it is similar to the European knight or Japanese samurai structure. However, it is not. Because these cases of single family having many generals in the military is an exception and not a norm. There are not enough of these families to make it into an actual class. And it's not that, as long as you're born into the Li family, you're always going to be a military general or military ranking officer. The moment the Li family falls out of favor, then their descendants are no longer part of the military structure. Whereas if you look at the knight and the samurai, if you're born into that family, you have the right to be in that class, and you are a knight and you are a samurai. That right usually cannot be taken from you. And if you are born a peasant or a farmer, no matter what you do, you're not going to become a knight or a samurai. I know there are very rare occasions where peasant might be knighted, but under normal circumstances the class are completely separated. Whereas if you look at the Chinese structure, anyone can become a general or any other ranking officers in the military structure, provided that either you have connection or you've done really well in certain battle, war or campaign. So therefore there is no actual structure or a class per se. Anyone from any birth can make his way, provided he's lucky enough and have enough skill or have enough connection, he can advance in the military and eventually become a general. A good example of this can be seen as Wei Qing, also from the same period as Fei Jiangjun Li Guang. He basically was not born into a military family, but he was given the general position because his sister, half-sister, was one of the most favored concubine of the Han Wudi emperor. And his family didn't retain that position afterwards. So from this you can see that generals and other military personnel, they come and go. It is not a class system where if you're born into it, you're definitely going to be one. And if you're not born into it, then tough luck, you can never become one. Which is why even though we can observe various examples such as the Li family throughout the dynasties, where one family has multiple generals coming out of them, etc., they are still not enough to constitute as a class system which we can observe in feudal European or feudal Japanese culture, whereas the knight and samurai, that kind of class just don't exist in China. So instead of what we mentioned earlier, where we have one knight for every 10 or 20 foot soldier, or one samurai for every 5, 6, 7 or up to 20 foot soldier, in China instead they have a military structure that's very similar to the Roman legionnaire, whereas obviously this differs from dynasty to dynasty, period to period, but let's just take the example from the Western Han dynasty. The smallest is a 50-man squad. It's called Tun and is controlled by Tunzhang. And this Tunzhang is basically just a person that's selected from this group of farmers or whatever else lifestyle they came from. The one that the superiors see as the most trustworthy or the one that he favors will become Tunzhang, and he will lead that 50 men. And 10 of these Tun makes 500, and it's called a Qu. And then the Qu is controlled by a Junhou. And then above him, multiple Qu put together becomes Bu. And Bu has a Xiaowei. And then it goes up all the way up to Budui, the military, and then it eventually goes up to the general. So you can see that very similar to Roman legionnaire, where it's subdivided into smaller ranking officers, and each officer is responsible to control the number of soldiers under his command. But take note that these officers, they are not a warrior class. Most of them are either farmers or from other walks of life. They're either selected because of their leadership or because of connection with the government or for various other reasons, but they're not selected for the individual combative ability. Now, given the size of the army that we find throughout Chinese dynasties, namely usually it goes above 100,000 men, sometimes up to 600,000 men, and there are even times where they claim to have 1 million, although that number is probably exaggerated. But given the scale of war, you can imagine if they have to maintain an elite warrior class in a ratio of 1 to 10 soldiers, it's just simply impossible to keep elite warriors on the payroll in this kind of ratio and not let them do anything other than train how to fight. Which is why these military officials and ranking officers, they are basically drafted just like other common soldiers and eventually work up the rank to become, whether it's Tunzhang or Junhou or whatever other rank they are able to reach. And at which point, their main skill that is required for the job is administration and management. It's not how well they can go onto the battlefield and how many enemy soldiers they can kill by themselves. The measurement of a good military officer is basically judged by whether or not he can carry out whatever his superior or the general has asked him to, whether he can carry out the strategy, the tactic precisely, whether he can control his 50 men, 500 men, or however many to do exactly what he wants them to do. That's the most important thing. If he charges out on the battlefield, killing people with his own combative skill, and he gets killed, then that entire squad is going to lose command. So that's not what the Chinese military want. Which is why these people, they are not selected for their martial skill. Instead, they're selected for how well they can carry out order and how well they can manage people below them. And most often, victory in the battlefield is determined by whichever side always has the superior number, superior supply line. But besides that, it is determined by how well is the strategy, tactic, battle formation, and coordination and discipline. Those things are far more important than individual combative ability. That's not saying that individual combative skill is not important. The soldiers do train, but given the context and the number, the formation and discipline is far more important. The larger the army is, the more important discipline and formation becomes. And upon a better strategy or positioning or tactic, army of similar size, the one side will just simply snowball roll over the other side, at which point individual ability is really hard to hold the tide against a superior disciplined number-based army. Combining all these factors, it's not hard to see why wrestling or any other advanced or niche combative skill are not going to be that popular among any of these military training. While there might be some rare occasion where you might be able to save yourself or kill more people with wrestling skill or some other high advanced training or niche training, but the chance of that happening is just so little that simply it's not worthwhile or practical to really force that upon all the soldiers. Now, that's not to say that the Han Dynasty troops didn't train. Like I said, there are not enough record to really check for sure. But the lack of record suggests that at least it's not that important. And they do train wrestling is most likely as a type of endurance, stamina, spirit. That kind of fundamental training is not a military tactic. The soldier are not instructed to go onto the battlefield ready to wrestle with the enemy. But of course, this will be covered more in detail in the next part of this video. And this is why if you read any description and record of famous military generals in the Chinese history, you will find that most of the description talks about how well his strategy, his tactics, and how well he leads his army. How well he executes amazing battle plans. There's almost no description on how well his own martial ability is, or how many soldiers, how many enemies he killed in a single battle. there's very little, right? There are some exceptions, but there's very little description about these famous military generals' personal combative skill. And this shows you that, individual combative skill are not really that important in the Chinese dynasty era military warfare. And on the rare occasion where a general or military officer's martial ability has been recorded in history, one of the most often used description is 弓马娴熟. What this basically means is that this particular person is very well versed in horse riding and archery. Notice how these two, riding horses and archery, is what is used to qualify whether a military personnel is great at his personal martial skill. There's almost no description about how good he is with a spear, with a saber, or with wrestling, or any of the other type of martial training. So 弓马娴熟 is the most commonly used qualifier to describe when a general is good at his personal martial ability. From here, you can see that the most important thing in the Chinese military, throughout from the Han Dynasty onwards, is your ability to ride horses and your ability to handle bow and arrow. And while these two are used to describe someone's personal martial ability, both skills fit directly into any type of formation or battle tactic. They are not individual martial capability. Well, compared to the Japanese hero, where most of it focuses on individual martial ability, whether it's how you handle a katana or a tachi, nodachi, spear, or any other weaponry used on the Japanese battlefield. The hero focuses more on one-on-one versing ability, whereas in China, 弓马娴熟, riding and archery, fall directly into a formation of fighting. So you can see the two modes is clearly different. Another description that you will find associating with famous generals and military officers in the records is 勇冠三军, which is basically a glory way of saying that this particular person is very brave, have massive bravery. Now you might think, okay, this might contradict with what we said so far. Like the officers, they are not encouraged to charge into battle by themselves and kill X amount of enemy. Their job is to lead and to pass on the general's orders and tactic and carry that out. So why is bravery such an important thing? Well, you see, bravery comes in the form of how well any officer can achieve the result. For example, the general says that this particular squad needs to go and capture that point, or capture that strategic location, or defend the rear line or whatever. Bravery is required to accomplish those tasks. So bravery here doesn't necessarily mean a single person charging in and killing enemy, which is commonly what people associate with bravery because of movies and film influence. But in reality, in the olden day military battlefield, bravery just means that you're not going to chicken back. When the general says you're going to charge forward, you have to inspire your squad to charge with you, even if it is charging towards certain deaths. And under such context, they're still going to function as a squad. They're still going to be under formation or whatever tactic is assigned to them. They're not charging on their own. So bravery doesn't necessarily mean individual heroism. It just means that you have the guts to carry out any job necessarily ordered to you by the commanders. Another thing I say so far is absolute. There are always exceptions to the norm. So what I've been describing so far is the norm. For example, there have been certain generals in the Chinese history who are famous for the individual combat abilities and the individual bravery. For example, Lü Bu is one of such, right? He's a very famous general during the Three Kingdom era, and he's always been praised for his individual combat ability. However, when historians describe him, they often use the term 有勇无谋 or 匹夫之勇, which basically means that he has bravery, but he has no tactic or no brain. And he isn't seen as a good example of what a good military officer or general should be. Like, he's often been used as a negative example to show people what you shouldn't do when you're leading an army. So from here we can see that even though there are cases where individual martial ability is quite significant with certain military figures in the history of China, they're not seen as a good example of what should be represented as the ideal military leader or officer. There are even examples of military led by generals who themselves are not actually even well versed in whether it is archery or any other combative skill, but they are so general because they have a superior understanding of the battlefield and they have a smarter mind for military tactics and strategies, which is why generals in China are required to know various versions of Art of War. Now, some people might think Art of War is just one book, right, written by Sun Tzu, but in Chinese, Art of War refers to 兵法, which means the way of the military or the military method. And there are different people on different periods who have written different type of 兵法. So Sun Tzu's Art of War is not the only one. And the general is required to know at least one or multiple different versions, and so therefore he knows how to lead the army, how to plan out his strategy. And if you look at the Chinese 兵法 compared to the Japanese 兵法, which they call 修候, right? The Chinese call 兵法, Japanese call 修候. If you look at the difference between Chinese 兵法 and Japanese 修候, you can clearly see a difference in the culture and the way they go about doing combat. For China, let's look at Sun Tzu 兵法, right? The Art of War, the most famous one. If you read through it, you see that there are no description on any combative ability or individual how to kill someone with a sword or with any kind of weapon. Instead, it talks about a mindset. For example, 兵无常势,水无常形, which means the way of the army has no set way, just like water has no set form. You can see this is a highly philosophical kind of mindset rather than teaching you how to kill someone. Another one will be 善用兵者,避其锐气,击其惰归, which means those who are excelled at leading a military would avoid the enemy's strengths and attack them in where they lack. Another one will be 兵者诡道也,故能而示之不能,用而示之不用,近而示之远,远而示之近, which refers to the way of the military is basically deceit. If you want to use something, you have to show them that the enemy that you are not going to use it. If you can do something, you got to pretend that you can't do it. If you are close, you want to make them think that you are far, and if you are far, you want to make them think you are close. You can see it's all kind of mindset kind of stuff, mind game and strategy and tactical planning. And of course, the most famous one, 知己知彼,百战不殆, which basically means if you know yourself and you know the opposing side or the enemy, then you will win every war. So from this you can see that the purpose of Art of War is to teach a type of mindset and the pattern of thinking on how to come up with better strategy and tactical advantage during battle. There's very little to no emphasis on any personal combative ability. Now, if you look at Japan and what they constitute as Art of War or Hyuho, right, their version of 兵法, you can clearly see a difference. Now, while that Japan also has the Chinese Sun Tzu's Art of War, which the shogun and various lords treasure heavily and studies. But what Japanese people themselves consider as Hyuho or the Art of War are basically the way of the samurai. For example, the most famous one is the Book of the Five Rings, written by the most famous samurai Miyamoto Musashi. And if you read through the Book of the Five Rings, even though he does talk a bit about tactics, what to do, on the mountain range, what to do on a flat plateau, etc. But most of that book is more about Niten Ichiryo, right? It's Miyamoto Musashi's own dual-wielding kenjutsu, right? The way of the sword. He described what kind of technique you should use when the enemy is taking in what kind of position. It's more about individual combative technique and skill rather than the grand picture of controlling a full battlefield. And as you well know, Miyamoto Musashi himself will have killed over 80 people in his life in duel and other type of sword-to-sword confrontation. He has never actually led an army in a war. So obviously he did not even qualify to write the type of Art of War that Chinese people consider as Art of War. But the fact that he can still call his book Hyuho, or the way of the military, or Art of War, you can see that in their culture, what constitutes Art of War is basically how to train samurai, how to make samurai better at their job. Now I know that some of you who've read the Book of the Five Rings might disagree with my assessment because in the book, Miyamoto Musashi actually criticized people who think that kenjutsu or kenjutsu masters is what Hyuho is all about, and he suggests that Hyuho is more than just learning how to use the sword. While it is true that he did indeed infuse philosophy into his writing, but if you really look at the fundamental knowledge of that book, it is still a book about kenjutsu. And when you go to learn Niten Ichirio, you are still essentially learning his sword technique, his dual wielding. And everything else is basically an extension from his sword technique. He believes that through understanding the sword, you can then see similarities in all other industry and professions around his time. Like, flower arrangement, pottery making. He believes that all of them share the same principle as kenjutsu. So that's what makes his writing kind of philosophical, but it doesn't make it on the same level of art of war as we can see in China. In fact, at the start of his book, he talks about how to train peripheral vision. And he talks about how exactly one should hold the blade. And he talks about how two-blade dual wielding is superior to having one blade. And he talks about how his dual wielding is superior to using a spear or any other weaponry. And later on in the fire chapter, he talks about how to knock down enemies' blades. So all of these things are highly specific personal individual martial skill, which is closer to martial arts than art of war in Chinese culture's context. And are things that you almost don't find in the mainstream art of war manuscript or military manuscript found in Chinese dynasties. And in his book, he also stated that if you know how to win a one-on-one duel and then learn how to fight 10 people, after that, there's no difference between fighting 100 or 1,000. And what he's trying to hint at is that learning how to fight one-on-one will eventually lead you to understand how to fight in an army. And this clearly contradicts what the Chinese people understand as the method of war or military, where formation and group cooperation is what determines victory. So you can't just have one person's single one-on-one ability and just magnify to everyone and therefore you can win war. That's a very different concept to what Chinese people understand as the key to winning war. And this also then shows you that this is the case because the scale of war drastically differs from Japan to China. And therefore, even though in Miyamoto Musashi's book, he talks more than just how to swing sword and what technique to use when the opponent is attacking in what way, still fundamentally it is a book about kenjutsu. It's just trying to understand everything else around it, including battle, through his understanding of kenjutsu. I'm not saying that this is wrong or incorrect, but it's very different from the Chinese understanding of art of war or the military method. And the difference should be pretty obvious to see. And he's not the only example. If you look at Tasha Ryo, look at Yagyu Shinkake Ryo, all of these olden day kenjutsu ryos, they are used to be referred to as hyuho. The reason for that is quite obvious because over there the war are fought mostly by samurais, which is why any kind of training that improves the samurai's ability to fight in battle is considered the way of the military. And only the elite generals, shogun and other lords actually care to study Chinese art of war, where you actually learn how to deal with tactic and strategy, whereas the samurai themselves, they understand the art of war. It's just how many enemies I can kill in one battle. So from this difference, you can clearly see that the concept of battle for Japan and China severely differs. Now that's not to say that all Chinese Bingfa or art of war does not include individual training. For example, Ming Danzi General Qi Jiguang, his military manuscript 纪效新书 does have chapters talking about how to use spear, how to use other weaponry, archery, but if you really look through it, there's still very little emphasis on individual cognitive ability. He talks about basic techniques and how to put them into formation and for better use for the grand picture of things in the battlefield. Well, if you look at Japanese, whether it is Yage Shinkake Ryo, Niten Ichirio, what they constitute as hyuho, or the way of the military, you clearly see that they have more emphasis on how to attack, different technique you can take, etc., rather than large-scale tactic and strategy. And we can further see examples of this during the late Ming Dynasty when the Japanese pirates invaded the Chinese southern seaboard around Fujian province. But according to record, these rogue samurais were highly skilled in the combative skill, and they often slaughter 5, 10, or even 20 Chinese soldiers, and none of them could even touch them. So this goes to show you that individual combative skill, the samurais are basically in general superior. Even these rogue ones, they're not even the main famous ones that are in Japan, right? These are the rogue ones that are jobless that then become pirates. Even then, the individual combative skills are so much superior. But eventually, when General Qi Jiguang took his troops to fight these pirates, he defeated them by having smarter formation and coordination and discipline, and having Yuanyang Zheng, which I've covered in my video regarding Miao Dao, right? So I'm not going to go into detail here. But basically, General Qi Jiguang overcomes the superiority of these samurais or rogue samurais by having better formation and smarter battle tactic. So you can also clearly see that what is valued in the Chinese military tradition is different from what is valued in the Japanese military tradition. And if you compare the two, then it's quite clear to see why in Japan they have elite warrior class that focuses on individual combative skill in the battle, whereas in China, ranked officers in the military are focused more on administrative and management and leadership skill rather than individual combative abilities. So from here you can basically see the first major difference between Europe, Japan versus China is that the number of troops that are involved in the war differ greatly, and therefore the effectiveness of one person's combative ability is not the same in these countries as to how much influence they can have on the outcome of the battle. And therefore, they focus and emphasize on different aspects of the battle in order to secure victory. The next thing that we're going to look at is the method of war. How do these Chinese people throughout the dynasties engage in war? What is the main method of war? And from there, hopefully you can see whether or not wrestling would actually help them to win this battle, or can just ignore it completely.